The humiliation you never forgot. You remember that moment, not because it was loud, but because it was silent. The message ignored, the look of indifference, the subtle dismissal that made you feel smaller than you ever admitted. You tried to act normal, you kept your composure, maybe even forced a smile, but something inside you shifted, something cracked, and you carried that weight long after the moment was gone. It was not just what they did, it was how it made you feel. That quiet tightening in your chest, that urge to explain yourself, to justify your value, to somehow recover the respect that seemed to slip through your fingers without warning. You replayed the scene in your mind again and again, wondering what you could have said differently, how you could have acted better, how you could have avoided that feeling of being less. But here's the part you were never taught to see. Humiliation does not begin in the moment of rejection. It begins long before that. It begins in the invisible space where your sense of worth becomes tied to someone else's perception of you. The moment you need to be seen, to be validated, to be chosen, you unknowingly give away something fundamental. You give away control. And people sense this. Not consciously, not logically, but instinctively. Human beings are far more perceptive than they appear. They read tone, hesitation, posture, energy. They detect need the same way predators detect vulnerability. You might say all the right words, you might try to appear confident, but if there is dependence beneath the surface, it leaks through in ways you cannot fully hide. This is why two people can say the exact same thing, and one is respected while the other is ignored. The difference is not in the words. It is in the internal state. One speaks from completeness. The other speaks from lack. And that difference changes everything. You were not humiliated because they were stronger than you. You were humiliated because, in that moment, you were not fully grounded in yourself. There was a silent request in your presence, a need to be accepted, a hope to be recognized. And the moment that hope was not met, your emotional stability depended on it. Carl Jung taught, through his exploration of the human psyche, that what you do not confront within yourself will shape your reality from the shadows. This need for approval, this discomfort with being alone, this fear of not being valued, it does not disappear just because you ignore it. It operates silently, influencing your choices, your behavior, your reactions. You may think you are just being social, open, connected, but underneath there may be something deeper, a subtle dependence on how others respond to you. And that dependence creates a fragile foundation. Because the moment others withdraw, reject, or ignore, your internal balance is shaken. This is why that moment stayed with you. Not because it was the worst thing that ever happened, but because it revealed something you were not ready to face. It showed you that your peace was not entirely yours. It showed you that your sense of self could be affected by someone else's indifference. And once you see this, you cannot unsee it. Because the truth is direct and unforgiving. The world does not respect those who need to be respected. It respects those who remain whole, even when they are ignored. It respects those who do not chase, do not beg, do not collapse in the absence of attention. But understanding this is only the beginning. Because what comes next will challenge everything you believe about connection, acceptance, and the price you pay for needing others more than you realize. The forbidden paradox. The more you need, the less you are respected. There is a rule that most people feel, but few dare to accept. The more you need someone, the less they feel compelled to respect you. It sounds unfair. It feels uncomfortable. But it governs human interaction more than any polite theory ever will. You were taught that showing interest, giving attention, and being available would create connection. That if you cared more, you would be valued more. But reality does not operate on intention. It operates on perception, and perception is shaped by power. Need creates imbalance. The moment your emotional state depends on someone else's response, you step into a lower position without saying a single word. You may still speak with confidence. You may try to maintain control, but beneath the surface there is a silent message being transmitted. It says, "I need something from you." And the moment that message is felt, the dynamic shifts. This is not about cruelty. It is about human nature. People instinctively move toward what feels complete and pull away from what feels dependent. Not because they are consciously rejecting you, but because dependence creates pressure. It carries expectation. It demands a response. And most people resist anything that feels like an emotional obligation. You can see this pattern everywhere once you learn to recognize it. The person who waits for a reply is more invested than the one who takes their time. The one who explains themselves is already negotiating their value. The one who seeks reassurance is placing their emotional stability in someone else's hands. And this is where the paradox becomes undeniable. The more you try to secure respect through effort, attention, and validation, the more you communicate that you do not already have it within yourself. And that is precisely what weakens your position. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations Book 6, paragraph 30 that the value of a person is measured by what they give their attention to. If your attention is constantly directed outward, waiting, hoping, seeking recognition, then your center is no longer anchored within you. It is scattered across external reactions that you cannot control. And when your center is not yours, neither is your power. This is why people who appear indifferent often receive more respect. Not because indifference is superior, but because it signals independence. It communicates that their sense of self is not at stake, that they are not trying to extract something from the interaction, and that absence of need creates space that others instinctively respect. But do not confuse this with coldness. This is not about pretending not to care. It is about no longer depending. There is a difference between valuing connection and needing it to feel whole. One comes from strength, the other from lack. Carl Jung emphasized that the individual who is not aware of their interdependence becomes controlled by it, and control, when invisible, is the most powerful form of limitation. You believe you are choosing your actions, but in reality you are reacting to an internal need that has not been examined. This is why you feel pulled to check your phone, to reread conversations, to anticipate responses. It is not curiosity, it is attachment. It is the mind seeking stability through external confirmation. And every time you respond to that impulse, you reinforce the very pattern that places you in a weaker position. Respect is not negotiated, it is reflected. It mirrors the relationship you have with yourself. If you rely on others to confirm your worth, you are already telling the world that your worth is uncertain. And uncertainty invites testing, but there is something even more unsettling beneath all of this. Because the need you carry is not just visible in your actions, it is readable in ways you do not consciously control. And what you are about to understand next will make you realize that people are perceiving far more about you than you ever intended to show. The hidden reading, how people detect your weakness without you realizing. You believe your thoughts are private, that what you feel stays inside you unless you choose to express it. But the human body does not obey that illusion. It reveals everything in fragments, in pauses, in subtle shifts that speak louder than words ever could. You may say you are confident. You may try to act composed. But if there is tension beneath the surface, it leaks. In the way your eyes search for approval after you speak. In the way your voice slightly changes when you feel uncertain. In the way your posture adjusts when you sense disinterest from the other person. These are not conscious decisions. They are signals, and people read them without effort. This is why someone can meet you for the first time and instantly decide how to treat you, not based on what you say, but based on what you transmit. And what you transmit is shaped by your internal state, not your intention. There is a silent conversation happening in every interaction, a layer beneath language where power, certainty, and dependence are constantly being evaluated. You cannot fake this layer for long, because it is not constructed through words, it is revealed through alignment. When what you feel internally does not match what you try to project, the inconsistency becomes visible. You have experienced this before, that feeling when someone seems unsure, even if they are trying to appear confident. You cannot always explain it, but you sense it, the hesitation, the need, the subtle pressure behind their presence. And without realizing it, You adjust your behavior in response. You take less seriously. You invest less. You feel less compelled to respect. The same is happening to you. Carl Jung described the psyche as something that expresses itself through symbols and behavior beyond conscious awareness. What you suppress does not disappear. It finds expression through your body, your tone, your reactions. And the need for validation is one of the most revealing forces within you. When you need to be liked, your behavior becomes adaptive. You adjust your opinions. You soften your boundaries. You tolerate what you should question. And these adjustments, even when subtle, are detected, because authenticity has a specific weight, and anything that deviates from it creates a sense of instability in the interaction. People trust what feels solid, they respect what feels grounded, and they distance themselves from what feels uncertain, even if they cannot articulate why. This is why over-explaining weakens your presence. It signals that you are trying to secure understanding instead of assuming it. This is why seeking reassurance diminishes your authority. It shows that your internal validation is not enough. And this is why reacting emotionally to small shifts in behavior exposes your dependence. It reveals that your state is influenced by factors outside your control. The body cannot hide what the mind has not resolved, and this creates a dangerous cycle. The more you try to compensate for your internal need, the more signals you emit. And the more signals you emit, the more your position weakens. Not because others are actively judging you, but because they are responding to what they perceive as instability. True control does not come from managing appearances. It comes from removing the need that creates the appearance in the first place. Because when there is no need, there is no tension. When there is no tension, there is no leakage. And when there is no leakage, your presence becomes clean, direct, and difficult to challenge. But this leads to a deeper question. If these signals come from within, if this need is not just behavioral, but psychological, then where does it originate? And more importantly, why do you avoid confronting it? What you are about to face next is not comfortable, because it will force you to look at a part of yourself you have been avoiding for a long time. The shadow of Jung. What you avoid in yourself makes you dependent. There is a part of you that you do not show, not because it does not exist, but because you learned, at some point, that it was not acceptable. The insecurity, the fear of being ignored, the discomfort of not being enough. You pushed it down, you covered it, you replaced it with behavior that looked stronger, more composed, more controlled. But it never disappeared. Carl Jung explained that everything you refuse to face becomes part of your shadow. And the shadow does not remain silent. It influences your actions from beneath the surface, shaping your choices without asking for permission. It is not the visible part of you that creates your dependence. It is the part you deny. You say you want connection, but what you often seek is relief. Relief from the feeling that something is missing within you. Relief from the discomfort of sitting alone with your own thoughts. Relief from confronting the parts of yourself that you do not fully understand or accept. And this is where dependence is born. Because if being alone forces you to face what you have been avoiding, then you will do everything you can to escape that state. You will look for distractions. You will seek people, conversations, attention. Not because you deeply value those interactions, but because they temporarily silence what is unresolved inside you. This is why silence feels heavy for so many people. It is not the absence of noise that disturbs them. It is the presence of themselves. Jung made it clear that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. You think you are choosing to reach out, to stay connected, to keep certain people close. But in many cases, you are reacting to an internal discomfort that you have not examined. You are not moving toward something. You are moving away from something within you, and the more you avoid it, the stronger it becomes. This creates a hidden form of dependence that goes beyond social behavior. You are not just attached to people. You are attached to the relief they provide, to the distraction they offer, to the temporary escape from your own internal tension. And because of that, your interactions are no longer neutral. They carry weight. They carry expectation. They carry an unspoken need that others can feel, even if you never say a word. This is why certain people seem unaffected by rejection. Not because they are emotionally empty, but because they have already faced what most people are running from. They have sat with their own discomfort. They have observed their own thoughts without needing to escape them. They have integrated parts of themselves that others still reject. And once you integrate what you feared, you no longer need someone else to compensate for it. This is the difference between independence and avoidance. Independence comes from confrontation. Avoidance creates dependence. If you cannot sit alone without reaching for distraction, then your mind is not under your control. It is being directed by what you refuse to face. And as long as that remains true, you will continue to seek externally what must be resolved internally. But there is something even more revealing beneath this, because this need to escape yourself is not just psychological. It is reinforced by something far more immediate, something chemical, something that conditions your behavior in ways you rarely question. What you are about to understand next will show you that your need for people is not always emotional. Sometimes it is neurological. The invisible addiction, emotional dependence as a form of dopamine. You think you are seeking connection. You tell yourself you just enjoy talking, sharing, being around people. But what if that urge is not as innocent as it seems? What if it is not about connection at all? What if it is a pattern your brain has been trained to repeat? Every time someone responds to you, your brain releases a small amount of dopamine, a reward signal, a subtle reinforcement that tells your system, this matters, do it again. It feels harmless. A message, a notification, a reaction. But over time, this creates a loop. You reach out, you wait, you receive, and your brain learns that external attention equals internal relief. This is where the shift happens. You are no longer interacting because you choose to. You are interacting because your system expects the reward. And once that expectation is established, absence becomes uncomfortable. Silence feels like loss. Delay feels like rejection. And your mind starts searching for ways to restore the signal. This is not connection. This is conditioning. And like any form of conditioning, it strengthens with repetition. The more you rely on external responses to regulate your emotional state, the less capable you become of sustaining stability on your own. Your baseline shifts. What once felt neutral now feels empty. What once felt optional now feels necessary. This is why you check your phone without thinking, why you revisit conversations, why you anticipate responses before they even arrive. It is not conscious. It is automatic. A pattern that has been reinforced so many times that it now operates without effort. And here is the danger. When your internal state depends on an external stimulus, you lose control over your emotional balance. Because you cannot control when people respond, how they respond, or if they respond at all. Your stability becomes unpredictable, fluctuating based on variables outside your reach. This is how dependence evolves into vulnerability. Because the moment someone delays, withdraws, or loses interest, your system reacts, not just emotionally, but chemically. There is a drop, a sense of absence, and your mind interprets that absence as something personal, even when it is not. This is why small things affect you more than they should, why a delayed reply can shift your mood, why a change in tone can create doubt. It is not just psychological interpretation, it is a disrupted pattern. And people sense this. They feel when your presence is seeking something. They detect when your attention is not freely given, but quietly expecting something in return. And the moment that expectation is felt, your position changes again, because need, whether emotional or chemical, creates the same signal. Marcus Aurelius warned in Meditations Book 7, paragraph 49, that you should not be disturbed by external things, for they have no power over your inner state unless you allow them to. But what happens when your inner state has been trained to depend on those very things? You lose that separation. You become reactive. And once you are reactive, you are no longer in control. The system that was meant to help you engage with the world begins to control how you experience it. And the more you feed it, the stronger it becomes. But this pattern does not exist in isolation. It is reinforced by something much larger. A structure designed to keep you stimulated, distracted, and constantly seeking the next signal. What you are about to see next will make you realize that your difficulty with being alone is not just personal. It has been shaped, amplified, and normalized by the world around you. The social trap, how the world trained you to fear silence. You were not born afraid of being alone. That fear was built, layer by layer, interaction by interaction, screen by screen. At some point, silence stopped being neutral and started feeling uncomfortable. Not because silence changed, but because your tolerance for it was reduced. You were gradually conditioned to associate stimulation with normality and stillness with absence. Look at the structure around you. Constant notifications, endless content, immediate responses. Everything is designed to keep you engaged, connected, reacting. There is always something happening, always something to consume, always someone to observe or be observed by. And without realizing it, you adapted to this rhythm. Your mind became accustomed to interruption, to novelty, to external input filling every gap. And once that pattern stabilizes, the absence of it feels unnatural. Silence becomes unfamiliar, and what is unfamiliar is often interpreted as discomfort. This is how the trap works. Not by forcing you to seek attention, but by removing your ability to remain without it. You no longer sit with your thoughts. You replace them. You do not process internal tension. You distract from it. And over time, this creates a dependency that feels like a need, but is actually a response to conditioning. The world did not just offer connection, it reshaped your baseline. Now, when there is no message, no interaction, no feedback, your system does not interpret it as rest. It interprets it as lack, as something missing. And that perception drives behavior. You reach out, you check, you fill the space. Not because you consciously chose to, but because you were trained to avoid emptiness. But emptiness is not the problem. Emptiness is where clarity begins. The problem is that you were never taught how to stay there long enough to understand it. So instead of facing what emerges in silence, you escape it. And every time you escape, you reinforce the idea that silence is something to be avoided, that being alone is something to fix. And this is where dependence deepens. Because if you cannot remain still without seeking external input, then your attention is no longer under your control. It is being directed by the need to escape internal discomfort. And once your attention is controlled, your behavior follows. This is why people feel restless without their devices. Why a few minutes without stimulation creates tension. Why moments that should be calm are quickly filled with something, anything, just to avoid being alone with the mind. It is not weakness, it is conditioning. But conditioning can be broken. The moment you recognize that your discomfort with silence is learned, not inherent, you begin to see a different possibility. You begin to understand that what you fear is not solitude itself, but what it reveals when everything else is removed. And that revelation is precisely what you have been avoiding. Because in silence, there are no distractions, no external validations, no temporary escapes. Only you and everything you have not yet faced. And this is where most people turn back. But if you continue forward, if you resist the impulse to fill the space, something begins to change. Slowly at first, then unmistakably. Because beyond the discomfort, beyond the urge to escape, there is a point where silence stops feeling empty and starts feeling powerful. And that point is where everything shifts. What you are about to see next is not gradual. It is decisive. It is the moment where a person stops reacting and starts choosing. The moment where dependence begins to break. The moment of break, when you stop chasing. There is a moment that does not look dramatic from the outside, but internally, it changes everything. No announcement, no visible transformation, just a decision that forms quietly, almost without words. You stop chasing, not because you are tired, not because you gave up, but because you finally understood. You understood that every time you tried to hold someone's attention, you were losing your own. That every effort to be chosen was placing you in a position where your value depended on someone else's response, and something in you refuses to continue that exchange. This moment does not come from motivation. It comes from clarity. A clarity that is built through repeated patterns, repeated disappointments, repeated realizations that no matter how much you adjust, explain, or give, It never creates the stability you were hoping for. So you stop. You stop checking for responses. You stop anticipating reactions. You stop rehearsing what you will say to maintain interest. And at first this feels unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, because you are breaking a pattern that has been reinforced for a long time. Your mind will try to pull you back. It will suggest that you should reach out, that you should not let things fade, that silence means something is wrong. But for the first time, you observe that impulse without obeying it. And that is where control begins. Because control is not about forcing yourself to act. It is about choosing not to react. This is the shift most people never reach. They continue responding to every internal signal as if it were a command. But in this moment, you see it for what it is. A pattern, a conditioned response, something that can be interrupted. And when you interrupt it, something unexpected happens. The urgency fades. That constant pressure to maintain connection, to secure attention, to keep the interaction alive, it begins to dissolve. Not instantly, but noticeably. You realize that the intensity you once felt was not coming from the situation itself, but from your interpretation of it, from your need. And as that need weakens, your perception changes. You no longer interpret silence as rejection. You no longer see distance as loss. You begin to understand that most things are neutral, and it was your attachment that gave them weight. This is where your presence starts to stabilize. You speak when you choose, not when you feel compelled. You respond when it aligns with you, not when you feel pressure. You allow space without trying to control what fills it. And in that space, something else emerges: respect. Not because you demanded it, not because you performed for it, but because you are no longer trying to extract anything from the interaction. Your presence becomes lighter, but at the same time, more grounded. Less reactive, more intentional. People notice this, even if they cannot explain it. Because when you stop chasing, you remove the imbalance. You remove the signal of need, and without that signal, the dynamic resets. But this is only the beginning of a deeper transformation. Because stopping is not enough. It creates space. But what you do with that space determines everything that comes next. And what you are about to understand will show you that being alone is not a consequence. It is a tool. One that, when used correctly, reshapes your mind in ways that no external validation ever could. The power of strategic isolation. This is not loneliness. This is training. Once you stop chasing, something unfamiliar appears: space. And most people do not know what to do with it. They rush to fill it again, to escape the silence they just created. But this is where the real transformation begins, if you choose not to run. Being alone is not the problem. Being unprepared to face yourself is. Strategic isolation is not withdrawal. It is deliberate. It is controlled. It is the decision to remove noise so you can observe what remains when nothing is distracting you. No constant input, no external validation, no one to impress, no one to respond to. Just you and the structure of your own mind. At first, it feels unstable. Your thoughts become louder. Old memories surface. Doubts that were buried start to appear. This is the part most people avoid. They interpret it as discomfort, as something wrong, as a sign that they need to reconnect with the outside world. But this is not regression. This is exposure. You are finally seeing what has always been there, just covered by constant stimulation. And the moment you stay with it, instead of escaping, something begins to reorganize internally. Because when there is no one to react to, you stop performing. You start noticing how much of your behavior was shaped by external presence, how your tone changed depending on who you were with, how your thoughts adjusted based on expected reactions, how your identity shifted to maintain acceptance. In isolation, that disappears. There is no audience, no feedback, no correction. And without those external references, you are forced to define yourself without influence, not through words, not through image, but through consistency of thought and action when no one is watching. This is where discipline is formed, not the discipline of routines and schedules, but the discipline of internal stability. The ability to sit without needing to escape, the ability to think without needing to distract, the ability to exist without needing to be observed. Epictetus taught in his Discourses, Book 1, Chapter 29, that no person is free who is not master of themselves, and mastery is not proven in moments of interaction. It is revealed in moments of solitude, when there is no external structure guiding your behavior. Strategic isolation removes that structure, and in its place you either discover control or you discover dependence. This is why those who have never learned to be alone feel lost when they try. They are not lacking strength. They are lacking familiarity with their own mind without interference. But if you remain, if you resist the urge to return to old patterns, something shifts. Your thoughts become clearer. Your reactions slow down. Your need for immediate response fades. You begin to see situations without the distortion of expectation. You begin to act based on choice, not impulse. And this creates a new kind of presence. A presence that is not shaped by who is in front of you. A presence that remains stable regardless of attention, approval, or rejection. A presence that does not fluctuate based on external conditions. This is where independence becomes real, not as an idea, not as a statement, but as a state of being. And once this state is established, something unexpected happens. The same world that once seemed to control your emotional state starts to respond differently to you. The dynamics shift again, but this time, not because you are trying to influence them, but because you are no longer affected by them. What you are about to see next is the inversion of everything you experienced before. The reverse effect. When you no longer need, the world starts to seek you. There is a shift that feels almost unreal when it begins to happen. You stop reaching, and suddenly things start moving toward you. Not all at once, not dramatically, but consistently enough that you notice the pattern. The same people who once took their time now respond faster. The same conversations that felt one-sided now carry more balance. The same presence that was once overlooked begins to be recognized without effort. And this is where most people misunderstand what is happening. They think something external has changed, that people suddenly became more interested, more respectful, more attentive. But the truth is simpler and far more precise. The only thing that changed was you. When you remove the need, you remove the pressure. When you remove the pressure, you remove the imbalance. And when the imbalance disappears, the interaction stabilizes. Because people are naturally drawn to what feels complete. Not perfect, not superior, but self-contained. A person who is not trying to extract attention creates a different kind of presence. One that does not demand energy, but holds it. And this difference is immediately felt. You are no longer trying to be understood, so your words carry more weight. You are no longer trying to be liked, so your behavior becomes more consistent. You are no longer adjusting yourself to maintain connection, so your identity becomes clearer. And clarity attracts, not because it is seeking attention, but because it is not. This is the inversion of the dynamic you experienced before, where once your effort created distance, now your detachment creates proximity. Where once your attention lowered your value, now your restraint elevates it. It is not manipulation, it is alignment. You are no longer interacting from a place of lack, so there is nothing to compensate for, nothing to prove, nothing to secure, and in the absence of that need, others feel free to engage without pressure. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 4, Paragraph 3, that a person's worth is reflected in the quality of their thoughts. When your thoughts are no longer centered on how you are perceived, but on what you choose to embody, your presence changes in ways that do not require explanation. You become less reactive, and that makes you less predictable. You become less available, and that makes your attention more valuable. You become less dependent, and that makes your presence more stable. And stability creates trust. People may not consciously understand why they respond differently to you, but they feel it. The absence of need, the absence of urgency, the absence of silent expectation, and in that absence, something new appears. Respect. Not the kind you ask for, not the kind you negotiate, but the kind that forms naturally when there is nothing in you trying to force it. But this is not the final stage, because attracting attention without needing it is only one part of the transformation. The real shift happens when your identity itself becomes unshakable, when your presence is no longer influenced by any external reaction, What you are about to understand next is what makes that state permanent. The unbreakable presence, how to become someone who cannot be humiliated. At a certain point, something within you stops negotiating, not out of arrogance, not out of indifference, but out of clarity. You no longer question your value in the presence of others. You no longer adjust your behavior to secure approval. You no longer explain yourself to be understood. And this is where humiliation loses its ground, because humiliation requires a specific condition to exist. It requires that your sense of self can be shaken by someone else's perception. Remove that condition, and the entire structure collapses. This is what creates an unbreakable presence. It is not about dominance. It is not about controlling others. It is about no longer being controlled by what others think, say, or do. Your internal state remains intact, regardless of external response. Someone ignores you, and there is no reaction. Not suppression, not forced composure, but genuine neutrality. Someone disrespects you, and you respond only if it aligns with your principles, not because your ego demands it. Someone withdraws, and you do not chase because your stability was never attached to their presence. This is where most people struggle to understand. They think strength is loud. They think power is visible. They think control means reacting in a way that proves something. But real control is silent. It is the ability to remain unchanged in situations that once would have destabilized you. Epictetus taught in Enchiridion paragraph 1 that some things are within your control and others are not. Most people understand this intellectually, but few apply it emotionally. They still react to what they cannot control as if it were their responsibility to manage it. But once this principle becomes internalized, your behavior changes without effort. You stop trying to control how others perceive you. You stop trying to manage outcomes that depend on external factors. You focus only on what is yours, your thoughts, your actions, your standards. And this focus creates a presence that is difficult to disturb, because there is no leverage, no hidden need to be liked, no silent expectation to be validated, no emotional dependency that can be triggered. Without these elements, there is nothing for others to manipulate, nothing to exploit, nothing to destabilize. And this is why such a person cannot be humiliated. Not because the world changes, but because their interpretation of it no longer creates vulnerability. They do not internalize rejection as a reflection of their worth. They do not interpret indifference as a loss. They do not allow external behavior to define their internal state. They observe, they decide, they act, and that is all. This does not make them distant. It makes them precise. Their attention is given by choice, not by impulse. Their presence is consistent, not reactive. Their boundaries are clear, not negotiable. And in that clarity, something powerful emerges. Peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on circumstances, but the stable kind that remains regardless of what happens around them. But there is one final step. Because understanding all of this means nothing if you cannot recognize whether you have truly reached this state. And what you are about to face next will force you to confront that directly. The final test. How to know if you have really learned to be alone. There is a point where knowledge stops being enough. You can understand every concept, every principle, every psychological mechanism, and still remain exactly the same internally. Because understanding something is not the same as embodying it. This is why the final test is not theoretical, it is lived. Ask yourself something simple, but uncomfortable. Can you remain completely alone without reaching for distraction, without checking for validation, without seeking confirmation that you matter in someone else's response? Not for an hour, not during a good day. But when nothing is happening, when there is silence, when there is no external reinforcement. Most people underestimate this question because they assume loneliness is about being physically alone. But the real question is psychological. Can you sit with yourself without trying to escape yourself? If the answer is no, then dependence still exists, and it does not matter how confident you appear externally. It does not matter how well you speak, how composed you act, or how much control you show in social situations. If your internal stability collapses in silence, then your foundation is still external. This is where true discipline is revealed. Not in performance, but in absence of performance. Not in interaction, but in isolation. Not in being seen, but in not needing to be seen. Carl Jung emphasized that individuation is the process of becoming whole by integrating what was previously unconscious. And one of the clearest signs of integration is the absence of compulsion, the absence of internal pressure to escape yourself. When you no longer need constant stimulation to feel stable, something fundamental shifts. Your attention stops being reactive and becomes intentional. You are no longer pulled by impulses that demand immediate relief. You begin to observe them instead of obeying them. And this observation creates distance. Distance from your thoughts. Distance from your emotions. Distance from your reactions. Not in a way that disconnects you from life, but in a way that prevents life from controlling you. At this stage, you begin to notice something subtle. You are no longer seeking validation as a source of identity. You are no longer measuring your worth through external feedback. You are no longer interpreting silence as absence. You are simply present. And presence without dependency is a rare form of stability. Because when you reach this point, external behavior loses its power over your internal state. Approval does not elevate you. Rejection does not diminish you. Attention does not define you. Absence does not disturb you. You remain unchanged. This is the real test. Not whether you can survive alone, but whether you can remain whole while alone. And if you can, then something irreversible happens. You stop being influenced by fear of abandonment. You stop reacting to the possibility of being ignored. You stop interpreting distance as threat. And in that state, your identity becomes self-contained. But there is still one final truth left to confront. Because even this level of stability leads to a realization that changes how you see everything you experienced before. And this final realization is where the transformation completes itself. The truth that frees and scares. You were never weak, you were attached. There is a final realization that does not feel like motivation. It does not feel uplifting in the conventional sense. It feels quiet, heavy, clear. Because once you see it, you cannot go back to the illusion you once lived in. You were not weak. You were attached. Attached to approval. Attached to presence. Attached to responses, attention, and the feeling of being acknowledged. And that attachment shaped the way you saw yourself far more than any external event ever did. This is the part most people resist, because it removes the excuse that others were responsible for their emotional instability. It brings the focus back to something internal, something personal, something that cannot be outsourced. The truth is simple, but it carries weight. Every time you felt humiliated, it was not because someone had power over you. It was because something in you was still available to be affected. There was still a place where external behavior could reach your internal sense of value. And that is what changed over time. Not the world, not the behavior of others, but your awareness of where your stability actually comes from. When you stop needing validation, something fundamental dissolves. The emotional leverage others once had over you disappears. Not because people change, but because the mechanism no longer works on you. You no longer interpret silence as rejection. You no longer interpret distance as loss. You no longer interpret indifference as a reflection of your worth. And because of that, the emotional weight of external behavior fades. This is where freedom begins. Not freedom from people, but freedom from dependence on their perception. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 4, Paragraph 7, that if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And when that estimate changes, the entire emotional structure changes with it. You begin to see that nothing outside of you has the authority you once gave it. And this is the turning point. Because once you realize that your reactions were never imposed, but generated internally, you stop blaming circumstances for your instability. You start observing your responses instead of being controlled by them. And in that observation, something stabilizes. You become less reactive, less dependent, less influenced by temporary conditions. Not because you suppress emotion, but because you are no longer identified with it. At this level, solitude is no longer something to endure. It becomes something to use. A space where your mind reorganizes itself without interference. A space where clarity replaces noise. A space where dependence dissolves naturally, without force. And then the final shift happens. You no longer fear being alone, because being alone is no longer a reminder of what is missing. It becomes proof of what is no longer needed. And when that happens, something irreversible settles inside you. You are no longer someone who avoids humiliation. You are someone who cannot be defined by it.